Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. And in today's episode, we are talking all about simulated altitude tents for mountaineers. And I'm answering the question if I recommend altitude tents or hypoxic tents for mountaineers who are going on a high altitude expedition. Now, this is a really common situation which often comes up, and why I'm talking about it today is it is just so common for mountaineers. Quite often we'll have a mountaineer who's preparing for a big high altitude expedition. Their issue is they live at sea level and they do not have easy access of high altitude to train on. Maybe they live in Australia with absolutely zero mountains at all to get on. Maybe they're in the US, but somewhere in Texas, and they may be able to get over for a weekend or two in some altitude, but it's not really very much. Or whatever it is, they're at this situation where they're just nervous about the high altitude. They're investing all this time, this money, this effort into this big climb, which is a dream of theirs, and they're just really worried about getting altitude sickness. They're really worried about not acclimatizing. They're really worried about the altitude just holding them back and getting in their way. And it is often the big question mark around these types of things. And what mountaineers tend to do in this situation is they will look at any edge they can get. They will go down the rabbit hole of Googling, of forums, of podcasts, trying to find anything they can do to give them an advantage at high altitude, which is absolutely fair enough. And one of the first things most people come across in this situation is simulated altitude training, using masks or chambers or altitude tents to prepare for altitude. And quite often, I will get the question from people, whether I first start working with them or it's just a random question that comes through, and people ask me, will an altitude tent help me prepare for a high altitude mountaineering climb? Now, I've talked about this subject quite a bit a few years ago, but I want to explore things today, specifically talking about tents, which are the more popular approach to this, and not just talk about the science of these types of things, and not just diving into, hey, are these the adaptations you get? Is there evidence? Is there not? Or whatever may be, but also get into the practicalities of using this type of thing, which I often feel like is just kind of glossed over when people are talking about this. They don't really explain or explore this enough. So I want to make sure we're getting into a few different areas as well. So ultimately what we're going to be covering today is, number one, how simulated altitude tents work. What are the claimed benefits of altitude tents for mountaineers? What does the science say about altitude tents? What climbers are saying anecdotally? How to get the best results if you are wanting to use an altitude tent? What are the potential drawbacks of altitude tents for mountaineers? What my personal opinion is when it comes down to altitude tents for mountaineers? And what are some good and not so good alternative to altitude tents if you're looking for an edge at high altitude? So we're going to be covering a vast range of things, and hopefully it'll just give you some good context and good insight into this topic. So to start with, how do altitude tents work? Well, it's very simple. Essentially, what we do in a tent, we are literally getting in a sealed chamber, a tent. What happens is we have a generator which pumps up nitrogen into that chamber. What happens with the nitrogen is this will change the percentage of oxygen that you're breathing in with each breath. What will happen is as we're breathing in this air with less oxygen, this will reduce our blood oxygen saturation, which is similar to what happens up at high altitude. The idea behind this is if we can get exposure to this type of stuff, it will trigger adaptations in the body, which is similar just to being up at high altitude naturally. That's the theory. Now, one thing to be really clear on before I even get any further, and I want you to keep this in mind as we move forward. This is simulated altitude training. This is changing the percentage of oxygen that we actually breathe in. One thing to be very clear on is this is not the exact same thing as what happens at natural altitude. At natural altitude, the percentage of oxygen that's in the air remains the same, and what actually changes is the air pressure. So while in both the simulated environment and the natural environment, our blood oxygen saturation will go down, it's from a slightly different mechanism, or I guess a slightly different thing that leads to it, in a very technical words. Now, this distinction, it is important to remember as we go through. Next up, what are the claimed benefits of high altitude tents for mountaineers? Well, really, there's three big claimed benefits. A lot of people say like a million and one things, but there's really three big things. People will say that altitude tents will help reduce the risk of altitude sickness, which is obviously massive if it's true. People will say that altitude tents will help re-acclimatize you, meaning if you're going on a fast acclimatization climb, this can replace those weeks you may spend at altitude, or if you're just going on a normal climb, this may give you an advantage to hit the ground running. And also, people claim that this will help improve endurance performance, and in this specific context, endurance performance for high altitude, which any benefit to our endurance up there is always going to be beneficial. So those are the big claims we often see people talking about. So what does the science say? What does the evidence say? What is sort of we looking at when we're actually diving into some of the research? And the tricky thing with this particular subject, and one thing that really, it does drive me a little bit mental, and I know it leads a lot of people in these weird directions when it comes down to this, is the science of altitude training, of using tents or masts or chambers. It can be really, really confusing. Because a lot of people will present altitude tents and altitude training as a whole in a very particular way. And the way they kind of present it and the way they use evidence and studies to kind of, make their case, it's often very, very misleading when you kind of dive into it. The tricky thing about this whole topic, about simulated altitude training, is there's ultimately three different types of altitude we need to be aware of. There's natural altitude, there's hypobaric altitude, and there's normobaric altitude. Now, natural altitude is literally you going up on a mountain. That's what happens when you go up. And there's absolutely no doubt in the world that natural altitude or terrestrial altitude is beneficial. If you can get exposure before your climbs, absolutely. If you can just live there or sleep there or train there, awesome. Next up, hyperbaric altitude. Hyperbaric altitude. There is a lot of evidence to say this can be beneficial if you're going up to high altitude. This can be beneficial if you can sleep in it or train in it. And this can have some really, really good benefits for potentially reducing the risk of altitude sickness or giving you some benefits for pre-acclimatization or improving your endurance performance. There's some really cool evidence for that. The problem is hyperbaric altitude is not what we have access to. This isn't what you get when you hire a tent. This isn't what you get when you go into an altitude training gym. Hyperbaric altitude training or hyperbaric altitude will change that air pressure, but that's not what we have access to. Now, normobaric altitude, that is what these tents do. That is what these chambers do. This is where we are changing that percentage of oxygen. This is what people have access to. And the tricky thing here is there's good evidence for natural altitude. There's good evidence for hyperbaric altitude, but normobaric, the science is a little bit hit and miss. And with this stuff, when they're looking at the research for normobaric altitude training, which is what you get from these tents, a lot of the studies will show some really, really, really cool results. And you'll look at the headlines, you'll look at the abstract, you're like, wow, that's like awesome. But then when you actually read the study and get into it, there's a few question marks that don't quite add up. For example, there's some studies I've seen where basically they say, show normobaric altitude training, so using these tents, will reduce the risk of altitude sickness. And in the abstract, they say, look, this reduces the risk of altitude sickness at this height and yada, yada. And you're like, cool, that's awesome, that's amazing. But when you read the study, what they've done is they basically tested altitude sickness and the risk of altitude sickness when people train and slept in a normobaric environment, and they actually reduced the risk of altitude sickness in a normobaric environment. So they haven't actually tested in that natural altitude. The tricky thing here is normobaric altitude will already have a lower risk of altitude sickness. So if we're reducing the risk of altitude sickness in that particular environment, all well and good, but we can't claim it leads to exactly the same thing on the mountain. So there's this really, really nice abstract, and people will say, hey, this proves this, but then you look into it, a bit of a question mark. On top of that, there are studies that will show it'll improve endurance performance, which is cool. Any improvements of endurance performance is great. But then when you look at the studies, quite often they'll sort of say, hey, we did this, we trained in this, we used this tent, and improve endurance performance at sea level. Or it will improve endurance performance in a normobaric environment. But when we're looking at actually performing in the mountains, there's sometimes question marks around it. And a lot of the studies, when they're actually looking at training and sleeping and preparing in a normobaric altitude tent, and then actually going up to natural altitude, well, some of that evidence isn't really amazing. And one thing that really, really annoys me in this particular space, and whenever I talk about it, I do get a little bit fired up, because people will often talk about altitude tents and they'll say it does this and this and this and this, and there's like all these amazing things, but they're really, really cavalier with just the studies they quote. They will say it will improve altitude sickness, but then quote a study which looks in normobaric altitude. They will say it will improve performance on the mountain, but then quote a study that actually they trained at natural altitude, and then they went up to natural altitude. And we know that that is beneficial, but they'll use that as evidence to show that their tents work. Or they'll say it pre-acclimatizes you, but then quote a study which has used a hyperbaric altitude environment as training or sleeping and saw improvements for that, but then say their tents will improve it. So when you look into it and start going into it and actually read the study that people are quoting, whatever it may be, you would be surprised how misleading so many people are, and just blatantly misleading. And all that aside, and all that my personal pet peeves on this subject, saying that, I'm not saying it's the worst thing in the world. I'm not saying there aren't any benefits. I'm not saying, there's no evidence out there which can show there's potential benefits. There does seem to be some benefits a mountaineer can get from simulated altitude tents. These benefits are similar to what happens at natural altitude. For example, there's some changes we get in our breathing. There's some changes we get in our oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, which are potentially great. Because if we can get these things at sea level or at home, and we get out on the mountain, fantastic, that's great. But just to be really, really, really clear, even though there have been some benefits that have been shown, these benefits are only part of the picture when it comes down to the full acclimatization process. It's good, yes. It's great, yes. This is beneficial and advantageous, probably, but you cannot say it's considered full acclimatization. You cannot say it'll automatically reduce the risk of altitude sickness. So we just need to be very, very clear on that. There are some potential benefits, but it's not pre-acclimatizing completely or anything like that. So that's kind of the science. And I know, that's like a little bit like, if you why don't you quote some studies, this and that, Rowan, but in all honesty, I've done that before. You can go into my old stuff and dive into that. You can look it up yourself. There's plenty of research there. But that's kind of like the general vibe of what I've seen. Now, getting on the more anecdotal side of things. What are climbers actually saying? Because as much as like sports science is interesting and useful, there's just so many variables that goes into this. And how hard and expensive is it for people to actually test this stuff on the mountain? It's not very practical, and that is one of the limitations around studies with this type of stuff. So we'll often see in sports science as people apply this and do this, and they'll practice this stuff for 10, 20 years, and then the science will catch up. So as much as anecdotal evidence isn't amazing, it is important to keep an awareness. And what climbers are kind of saying, even though the science is kind of, maybe a few question marks around it, this and that, there are definitely many, many, many climbers that use this because anyone is looking for an edge here. And there are a lot of people who do seem pretty positive about it. There are companies out there, which I'm sure you've seen before. They're offering these big 8,000 meter climbs, but what they're doing is they're offering these fast climbs. They're shortening down that acclimatization that typically and traditionally people do, which we know that works, but takes a lot of time and obviously expense. And these companies will offer tents at home and actually say you need to use this as part of the process if they're going to join on these trips. And we do see people out there who are seeing some success with this. We do see people who are doing these fast climbs. You're like, wow, is that really possible? But on the flip side, we're also seeing plenty of people not seeing success with these things and come back and like, oh my gosh, I felt rubbish. Who knows what the actual numbers are? Well, there is definitely people out there who will be advocates for it. Beyond that, there does just seem to be a general, vibe in the mountaineering community. And this is a general, I don't want to say consensus, but kind of, vibe is more the right word, that using an altitude tent can be useful for more moderate altitudes. So not so much getting you ready for 7,000 or 8,000, whatever it may be, But if you're doing a climb up to about 4,000 or whatever it may be, people are saying, hey, this is actually helping me. This is making me feel more comfortable. This is helping me get up there and just be a little bit more in control. So this could potentially be beneficial if you're looking at a more moderate climb, or if you're like, hey, I'm going to be doing a moderate and then I'm going up super high, maybe I just want to give my body an advantage at these moderate levels. So as I go higher and higher and higher and higher, maybe I've just got some more reserves, or maybe I've got a little head start, or whatever it may be. Again, this is more of a vibe in the community. There's lots of anecdotal people talking about this and reporting back on this. So, it does sound pretty positive, and, there's definitely no drawbacks in regards to that, because any benefits for this is great. But, again, I would sort of take it with a grain of salt, because with anything like this, especially in the adventure community, there is always the survivorship bias, in the sense that when everyone's looking at something cool like this, people invest time and money and effort into something, whether it's for preparation or a particular approach or whatever it may be. If they do this and invest all this time and they see success and they're like, that really worked for me, that was great, whatever it may be, they love to talk about it. They'll get on podcasts, they'll get on articles, they'll go out and tell the world, this is amazing, this does this and this and this and this, which is cool. But then you have the other people who do invest in all of this and who don't see the results, and they're like, I just felt behind, or I didn't really feel any difference, or whatever it may be. And they don't want to tell people. They don't want to tell people they failed on the mountain, or had a rubbish time, or they made a mistake, or whatever it may be. So they'll be a bit quieter. So we just need to take it with a grain of salt. I won't discount this, because a lot of people are saying, hey, cool, I'm seeing some benefits, I'm feeling good. And in all honesty, I'm just interested in seeing over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, what is going to happen with the evidence. If there is a little bit more direction, if there is a little bit more, consensus, and maybe in potentially some clearer training guidelines, or whatever it may be. So science, certain situations, a little bit hit and miss. Seems like there's some decent benefits in certain situations. Anecdotally, some people are saying some decent benefits as well, which all sounds well and good. Now, if you are going to be using an altitude tent, one thing that really, really, really you need to keep in mind, if you are wanting to get the best results from altitude tents, is the number one priority with this type of thing. If you are looking at getting those potential benefits we mentioned before, time of exposure is key, meaning you need to be investing a significant amount of time in this. From what I've read, to get consistent results, because everyone is a little bit different. Some people are responders, some people not responders, some people are fast, some people are slow, or whatever it may be. If you want to be confident that you will see some consistent improvements from this type of thing, you need a minimum exposure of 250 hours in this environment. So what this equals out to be is, if you're sleeping 8 hours a night, and you're doing that 7 days a week, that's going to be about 4.5 weeks of using this. On top of that, I know when people are looking at big mountain climbs and people are training for this, even 4 weeks tends to be not what that people recommend. They usually recommend people use these for about 6 to 8 weeks when they're looking at more bigger mountain climbs. That's a lot of time invested. So you need to be clear here. If you are going to use this, if you want to see some results, if you want to potentially see some benefits, if you're just doing a few sessions here and there, maybe a couple of times a week, or if you only do it for 2 or 3 weeks before you go, or if you're just going into a training chamber and just training for like an hour a few times a week, it's not going to be enough time of exposure for you to see these potential benefits. You need to invest the time and do it right if you're going to use it. Very, 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 very clear. Next up, let's talk about some potential drawbacks, and some practical drawbacks when it comes down to altitude tents for mountaineers. Because all of this sounds pretty good. Even if there are only, some question marks around the benefits, and you're like, well, it may not give me full acclimatization, but if it improves maybe my red blood cell count, or maybe improves my hemoglobin count, or whatever it may be, that sounds cool. And I want every single edge I can get to get on the mountain. That's really, really cool. But we need to be aware there are some few potential drawbacks which need to be discussed. A few that have been touched on a few times, and one which I never hear getting talked about, but is so, so, so important. Now, first of all, let's talk about sleep and recovery. Because if you are going to be using one of these tents, your sleep and your recovery probably is going to be affected. There is a certain amount of noise that comes from the generators which can affect some people's sleeps. In that particular environment, if you're in a tent, it can get hot and stuffy, and that can affect your sleep. You can end up just either waking up a bunch of times in the night, or struggling to fall asleep, or having lighter sleep, or whatever it may be. Not that everyone has that, but it is a very, very common occurrence for people. On top of that is if we are putting ourselves in this particular environment and we are triggering these adaptations and a bunch of things happening in this environment, the body just as a whole is going to be taking a bit more stress. To be aware of this, if our sleep is impacted, we're adding extra stress to our body, this is going to impact our recovery. Sleep's a massive factor for recovery, and we need to be aware of this because considering if you're using an altitude tent, you are going to be using it in the final months of your training and your peak phases as you're leading up to your climb. This is when you're putting this into action. This can be an issue because during this time, if you're doing all your hardest training, if you're doing your biggest training volumes, you are putting so much into it. And if you're at the point where your recovery is not up to scratch and you are recovering, that can be an issue. At the most basic level, if you're not recovering as well as you need to be from session to session or week to week, you may just not be getting all the benefits of the hard work that you're putting in. You may not be consolidating all those adaptations that you're trying to get from your cardio, from your strength training, from your hiking, from your running, all of that. Maybe getting some benefits, but maybe not quite as much as you could be getting if you were recovering better. On a more serious level, this can absolutely put us at a higher risk of just burnout and getting sick. The amount of mountaineers in their final months who are just hanging on by a thread in regards to their training. They're like, oh my gosh, I've been training for 11 months now. I'm sick of it. I've had enough. The goal is in sight. I'm just holding on. And if we're under recovering in that mental state, that can be tough. And getting sick, if we're run down, we're under-recovered, if we pick up the flu or a cold or something in the last month, that can completely derail things. We can miss out in this last little peak phase. It can be really tough. So we need to be aware of if I have any issues, being worried about my recovery and my sleep, this is going to be a factor. Another potential drawback is reduced training performance, because following on from this, if your recovery and your sleep are affected, this may potentially, not always, but may potentially affect how much effort and energy you can actually put into your training. Meaning, if you're doing specific interval structures, you may not be able to push quite as hard as you need to be to get the best results. If you're doing strength or endurance training, you may not be able to push quite as much as you need to get the best results. If you're doing long sessions, you may not be able to get quite as far, or you may fatigue early and get impacted there. Considering, again, this is the time where you're going to be doing your hardest training, this may be a case of taking one step forward, two steps back. We're getting some adaptations from the tent, but we're limiting the adaptations we're getting from the training. Now, obviously, this is really hard to quantify here, and we're never going to be 100% going to be able to say, hey, this was a net positive or a net negative, but it definitely is a factor we need to be aware of. The next drawback, which I don't think gets talked about enough, but I really do want to talk about this because it is so significant. A drawback to altitude tents can be the impact they have on your relationships. And I've seen this mentioned a lot of times, but just like a sentence, but I think it needs to be explored. Because over the years of training mountaineers and hikers as well, I've had numerous people use altitude tents over the years in various ways. Some people have come back and they said, look, that felt quite useful. I was a big fan of the results. Some people came back and like, nah, that barely did anything for me and I'm never doing that again, whatever it may be. But even from the people who have seen the results, the majority of people that I've directly worked with and coached, they haven't really wanted to use them again, even if they felt some benefits. The biggest reason for this has been the strain it has put on their relationships. If you have a husband, a wife, a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or whatever, this is a really serious and significant consideration you need to take. Because let's just put this in a picture. If you are going and doing a big mountain climb, and if you're already spending a significant amount of time away from them, maybe you're going to be spending 2 or 3 weeks over in the mountains, maybe multiple months or whatever it may be, that's already going to be a bit of a hurdle for your relationship, unless you're obviously lucky enough for them to come with you. On top of that, you are likely going to be investing a huge amount of time training. Endurance training for mountaineering, you can't get away from it. There's a lot of hours invested. You're going to be spending your weekends doing your long sessions. You'll be up early or late feeding in training. This is going to be another impact on your relationship. And if you have a fully supportive partner who is in, they understand, they're like, yep, I'm all for it. This can be tough to navigate, but it's doable. Many people do it. All good. But then, if you layer on top the need to spend 4 to 8 weeks sleeping in a tent, this can really be a major issue. This can lead to less time you spend with them. You won't be able to really sleep with them. They won't want to sleep next to the generator. They won't want to have a tent in between you. It limits the time you have with them. You won't be able to go out and spend early mornings or evenings or whatever if you have to get your 8 hours. Your mood is probably going to be affected. If you're not sleeping quite as well, if you don't have that nice feeling of just sleeping together, this can affect your mood. And this can absolutely affect just your day-to-day with them. And if you come into your final weeks of training, where you're peaking that training, putting so much effort and time and energy into it, your mood is already going to be low because you're going to be tired, you're going to be fatigued. Your stress is going to be high because you're finishing up work, doing your last minute logistics, have that nerves about going away. And then your partner has that stress as well because they're maybe helping out with the cooking or maybe helping out with the kids. Maybe they're worried about you going up this because they've heard those stories on the news or whatever it may be. All of this stuff is going on. And then you can't actually spend time with them at night. Is that something you're going to be able to handle? Now, that may sound like an exaggeration, but I've had so many people in the past, this has been a significant issue. And this has been not just something you can breeze past, but a genuine hurdle. I haven't really seen this talked about enough, but it is very, very significant. And the final drawback for this, potential drawback, I should say, of the attitude tents is cost. Obviously, renting or buying a tent, it's not cheap. You're going to be investing $100, $200 a week or something like that, depending on what you're using for 4 to 8 weeks. It's a significant amount of investment. Obviously, these big mountain climbs or high altitude climbs, they're not cheap. Mountaineering isn't the cheapest sport in the world, but is another consideration as well. So with that being said, what is my personal opinion on altitude tents for mountaineers? This isn't the empirical outcome. This isn't like the absolutely 100% right, whatever it may be. This is my personal opinion, having trained many, many, many mountaineers, many, many, many hikers for high altitude ventures over the years. I personally do not recommend altitude tents for most mountaineers. If someone wants to use one and they're like, yep, I've got this, I'm going to use it, whatever it may be, I will absolutely support it. And I'll adjust our training around it and do everything we can to make it go as smoothly as possible. But it's not something I recommend. It's not something I push towards people. And I just don't think the benefits, or there's enough evidence for these consistent benefits for people to kind of weigh up all those, I guess, potential drawbacks and just the effort of it all. I would much prefer people just to focus on their training, do the right things, invest their time, their effort there, recover properly, and go and have a proper acclimatization on the mountain that works. Much prefer that. And if a mountaineer ever came to me and said, hey, I'm tossing up to either do a normal climb or a fast acclimatization climb and using a tent, I would 100% say do a normal climb if it's realistically possible. I understand sometimes it's not possible, and I understand people can't invest all the time over the mountains or whatever it may be, but if there's any chance of you doing a normal acclimatization schedule, absolutely. The only people I would recommend that would get the best benefits with the least amount of drawbacks for altitude tents are a mountaineer who is single or has a partner who is going on the same expedition with them. So you can actually not have to worry about those relationship issues. I would only make sure they have a well-balanced and created training program. So something that is going to manage their training load. It's going to build them up in the right way. And also probably someone who has a history of a similar program. They've gone through a process like that before. So they're actually aware that when I get to those peak weeks, am I a normal human being? Can I handle that peak in output? Or am I a shell of a human being, and to layer something else on top is going to be trouble? On top of that is absolutely, if you're going to be doing this, you 100% want to be on point with your nutrition. If your sleep and your recovery is going to be impacted, nutrition plays a massive, massive, massive role. So many mountaineers just undereat. They don't support their training. They don't support their recovery with their nutrition. You want to be on point with that. And also on top of that, if you have a relatively low stress life, if you're not working 60 hours a week or you don't have young kids or whatever it may be, you may have some stress in your life, but, adding a little bit extra stress in the tent and a little extra stress from not sleeping quite as well isn't going to be a big deal. I would sort of say that is the type of situation where I'd be like, yeah, go for it. Like, absolutely go right ahead. But if not, I'm not a massive fan of it. But that's just one man's opinion and one coach's opinion. So with that being said, what are some potential good alternatives for altitude tents for mountaineers? If you were a mountaineer who was going up to high altitude and you were like, I kind of want something that's going to give me an edge. I'm nailing my training. I'm doing the basics. I'm getting it all right, but I kind of want to do more. But maybe the altitude tent's not quite going to be right for me, or maybe I just don't want to do it. What are some alternatives? Well, a couple of things you can potentially look at. Now, to be clear, when I say alternative here, what I'm about to recommend, it's not like a one-to-one replacement. These things I'm about to recommend are not designed to pre-acclimatize you. They're not going to make a major difference for your altitude sickness. They're not going to try and give you the exact same potential benefits as simulated altitude training or altitude tents. But these are alternatives in the sense that if you're a mountaineer who's going up to high altitude, and if you are already nailing your training and you're looking for something extra, which may just give you an edge at high altitude, these are two alternatives which I think can be really potentially great to look into. The first one, which can be a nice little edge, is respiratory muscle training. Now, if you haven't heard about this before, this is essentially strength training for your breathing muscles, essentially following a very particular training protocol to build up the strength of your breathing muscles, specifically your inspiratory breathing muscles. This is a very particular method of training, but it does have some really cool potential benefits for high altitude. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll probably do a full episode on this in the future, but just really quickly rattling off the potential benefits of this type of training. It can potentially delay the onset of premature fatigue of breathing muscles. Breathing muscles will fatigue or do fatigue up at high altitude. This type of training can delay that, meaning they can stay fresher and have less fatigue. It can also delay what's called this muscle metabolic reflex onset, which is this funny thing where basically what happens is once our breathing starts working really, 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 really hard and it gets to a certain point, what can happen in the body is the body will be like, hey, my breathing muscles need more blood. So it will pull blood away from the working muscles, pull blood away from other ways. So when you're actually climbing, when the legs really, 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 really want blood and oxygen, there'll actually be blood pulled away to the lungs. So this type of training can actually delay that. And it's been seen at high altitude. It can decrease the perception of dyspnea. I always say that word wrong, but basically the feeling of uncomfortable breathlessness, which a lot of people get at high altitude. This can reduce that. Respiratory muscle training can increase blood oxygen saturation values at high altitude and can also improve processing speed and working memory during exercise at altitude, which is pretty cool. Now, all of these things are potential benefits. There is some cool evidence for this. I wouldn't sort of say there's enough evidence to say this is exactly what you're going to get, but it all sounds pretty good. Now, the reason why I like this and the reason why I would promote this over an altitude tent for a mountaineer is because for this method of training, respiratory muscle training, the protocol is much more realistic. To get results from this type of training, what you're going to be doing is 6 minutes of training per day. 3 minutes in the morning, 3 minutes in the evening, for about 6 weeks before your climb. The only drawback to this type of training is you can't just do it at home by yourself without anything. You can't do this holding your breath or breathing through one nostril or anything like that. You have to buy a specific device which will load up your breathing muscles. And essentially it's like a dumbbell for your breathing muscles. They'll cost you like $100, $200 or something like that, so you do need a particular device. But I do like this. Because best benefits, if you do this type of training, you'll get some good benefits from your climb. You may get some of those stuff I mentioned before. Fantastic. Worst case scenario, say you did it and you just didn't get any of those benefits. Say it was just a scam, it didn't work for you, whatever it may be. Worst case scenario, you're still not going to lose much time. 6 minutes a day. What's that, like 36, 42 minutes a week for 6 weeks? However many minutes of that, it's not a huge amount of time. It's not going to impact and negatively impact your other areas of training. And you're only out about $100, $200. So I do feel like this is a cool alternative. As I said, I'll go into deeper in this in future episodes, but it can be good. Another good alternative here And again, it's not a one-to-one alternative, but I think it's a really good place to put your money and your time is working with a dietitian who specializes in mountain athletes. Why? Well, so many mountaineers just do not have a good handle on their nutrition. So many mountaineers just don't eat enough to support their training and recovery, don't know how to balance out, their macronutrients, and just do not have a good handle on things, which affects their energy output, how much they can put into their sessions, which affects their recovery, and all of that. Working with a dietitian who specializes in mountaineers, you can make sure you're getting the best out of your training. You can make sure you get some good tips to help you on the mountain, and it's just such worth your time. Again, if you're just looking for that edge, that's a really, really, really good thing to look into, which I think too many mountaineers just sleep on. Now, before I wrap things up, last thing I want to cover is some poor alternatives for altitude tents. So alternatives that I have seen people talk about and people ask about, which are alternatives, but I don't think they're good alternatives. So this is going to be three. Three I'm going to cover really quickly, then I'm going to wrap things up. Number one is altitude chambers. So simulated altitude training can be done in a tent or a chamber or a mask. All the same thing, nitrogen pumping out and whatever may be. As we said before, for this type of thing, if you want to get the potential benefits, you need exposure. You need those hours. A lot of altitude training gyms, you'll go into a gym, you'll train for an hour or 2 or 3 each week. This may give you some benefits, that is not going to give you the time of exposure you need to actually see these results for the high altitude. You may be able to do some training here and then go out in the sports field or go for a run at sea level and see some nice results. That's all well and good. But if you're specifically looking for high altitude results, chamber's not where you go. Do a tent if you're going to do it, but the chamber, it's just not enough time. Another poor alternative for altitude tents are the so-called elevation masks. These used to be marketed as altitude masks. And the difference between this and what I was talking about before, a genuine simulated altitude mask will be a mask you put on your face, which will be attached to that generator, which will pump out that nitrogen, which will change that percentage of oxygen in the air. You can literally just get a mask set up and have that. These elevation masks, they don't do that. You put on a mask, it basically has an adjustable valve and it just restricts the breathing you're breathing in. It's similar to kind of breathing through a straw. There's no change in percentage of oxygen. And for these masks, they used to be marketed as being really, really good to prepare you for high altitude. They used to say, hey, you change this valve, it'll go to this amount of elevation, this amount of elevation, this amount of elevation. This will help you prepare you for the thin air and all of this. But when it comes down to it, elevation masks have no specific benefits for high altitude. They don't change the percentage of oxygen in your blood. There's no evidence for that. Some people claim these can be a good option for respiratory muscle strength, which we mentioned before can be pretty good. And there are some potential benefits there, but they're not really an amazing stimulus. And if you are looking at that, you definitely want to go down using a traditional respiratory training device where you can load your breathing muscles up properly. And probably if you're looking at these, they may give you benefits in certain sports, but it's probably more higher intensity sports rather than endurance sports. There are certain elements and measures of fitness that does improve, but they're more relevant to things where you do short, sharp bursts of energy, as opposed to endurance mountaineering where we're doing long, steady things. And the final thing I want to touch on is a poor alternative for altitude tents is breath hold training. Now, I need to talk about this because it is getting a little bit more popular coming up, and as a subject, does drive me a little bit mental. Because breath hold training, apnea training has been around for a long, long, long time. There are some potential benefits for this type of training. But just recently, last, 5 years or something, it has been rebranded by some people to be called something called simulation of high altitude training, which is an incredibly misleading title. Now, I'll likely do a full breakdown of this in another episode, but just to be really, really clear. Breath hold training, there's a lot of different ways of going about this. It basically involves you holding your breath at rest or during exercise in certain ways. Certain people bill this as simulation of high altitude training. They call it this because if you do it in a certain way, when you look at your blood oxygen saturation, you can actually see the levels drop. And they're like, hey, if your blood oxygen drops, that's a simulation of what's happening at high altitude, all well and good. For a general population, people who are just living their everyday lives, okay, cool, you can do that. For a mountaineer, this does not add up. I do not recommend it, and it will not give you really any particular benefits for high altitude or acclimatization or whatever it may be. Why? Well, I actually did the certification of a very popular person relatively recently who is a big, big advocate for this type of stuff. And number one, a lot of the claims about this type of stuff, when I went through their certification, a lot of it they just made up. It was really bizarre. And a lot of the things that they sort of said, they said, hey, this will improve this and therefore it will improve this. Here's a study that proves this. And you looked at the study and you're like, that's talking about something completely different. It was really bizarre. And on top of that, there's a lot of studies out there which they say, hey, there's this one study that showed this and it was really amazing, so therefore it'll improve this. But then there's just one study. We haven't seen any other studies. So it's really, 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 a little bit question mark. But even outside of that, and I won't go on a whole rant because I want to wrap things up, let's just look at logic. We were talking about altitude tents before. If the recommended training protocol for altitude tents is you want to get a minimum of 250 hours of exposure to that simulated altitude environment, and that is going to give you consistent results. And even then, it is not going to fully pre-acclimatize you, whatever it may be. How do we think that just getting a few minutes here and there per day of reduced blood oxygen saturation in this environment, how do we think that is going to measure up? It won't. A lot of people talk about this and they love the name, they love the theory, they love the idea, and it sounds really, really cool, but it just doesn't hold up in this type of context. If you have to go up on a mountain, spend day after day and week after week, yeah, no. May give you some benefits for certain breathing things, but when we're talking specifically about high altitude, not so much. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap things up here. A lot of information we covered today, but hopefully this gives you some good insights. As I said, science may change on this. We may over the years get more and more evidence to say, you know what, tents are the way to go. But for now, there are some potential benefits. There are some potential drawbacks. For my personal opinion, I'm not a massive fan of it. I know a lot of people love it. A lot of people see results. But for me, I'd much prefer Mountaineers just to hone in on their training, nail their training program, nail their recovery, nail their nutrition, and do a proper acclimatization schedule. I personally believe that's where you want to put your focus, but, whatever you may want to do. So with that being said, last thing I will say is if you are a mountaineer who is leading up into a big high altitude climb and you're in the situation where you want to do everything you can to get in the best possible physical and mental position for this adventure, I would love to chat with you. Through our online summit program, our online personal training for mountaineers, we've helped many, many, many people prepare for big high altitude climbs when they live at sea level. And our training is very, very effective. So if you want to learn a little bit more, you can go to summitstrength.com.au/mountaineer. There's a big video on that page. You can check it out. And if you want to learn a little bit more and have a bit of a chat, there's a link where you can book a free call with us on that page and we can take it from there. So with that being said, thank you for listening. Hope you have a lovely day and we'll talk to you very, very soon. Bye.